Is a member of the Faraday staff. He's one of our research associates to natural disasters. He's done work out in the Philippines, in Haiti, in New Orleans, and in the Somerset Levels. So Revd Dr Roger Abbott. Roger has a PhD in practical theology, has done over 30 years in church pastoral work, and he's going to talk to us today on our response to natural disasters. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you. I just want to start, strangely enough, with an advert for a conference which the Faraday are running this coming April, 13th to the 15th of April in Westminster College. These flyers are available on the back. This is I hesitate to say this, but almost a unique occasion where we're bringing together expertise from an academic point of view, science and religion and theology, but also we're bringing together a number of survivors of disasters from Haiti, from New Orleans, and from the Ebola. Not a survivor, but a doctor who attended at the Ebola in Liberia. So this is a really exciting event. I would say that, but it really is. So I draw your attention to it. It's and you can follow the procedures on the website as well. It's on our own Faraday website for signing up to it if you so do. But I would encourage you to do so if you have any interest in this field. This slide just introduces me, which has already been done. But that is the floral display that was half the size there of what it turned out to be in Manchester following the bombing, the terrorist bombing at the Manchester Arena. I was a responder to that event with another hat on. So I just want to assure you that we're going to be talking today not just about what happened overseas, but what happens here in the UK as well. The biannual UN Global Assessment Report for 2015, 2017 one hasn't come out yet, has both bad news and good news. The bad news is that more than 1.5 billion people have been affected by human-caused and natural disasters over the last 10 years. Can you absorb that? Between 1980 and 2012, 42 million life years were lost in internationally reported disasters each year. The concept of human life years provides apparently a better representation of disaster impact, as it provides a metric describing the time required to produce economic development and social progress. Even more staggering, and in a sense more relevant for us, is over 80% of the total life years lost in disasters are spread across low and middle income countries, representing a very serious setback to social and economic development. That's the bad news. The good news, according to resurgent research, including my own, surprisingly few people suffer long-term mental health problems compared to typically held assumptions about trauma, indicating to us something we must never forget, that human beings can be hugely resilient. And in an age of trauma industry, remembering that is very, very important. I present those figures as a reminder of how serious our subject is this morning, wherever in the world we may be living. Now, this being the kind of event it's intended to be, namely for the edification and instruction of church workers, I want to make it as relevant and as accessible as I can. My research specialization is in the field of what are typically called natural disasters. That is, disasters associated with the events of nature, which fall typically into this categorization: geological, meteorological, climatological, hydrological, biological, and extraterrestrial. And it's interesting that the MDAT, the International Disaster Database, and the Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters, excuse me, lists these categories under natural disasters. However, for the moment, anyway, it's only those under the category of hydrological and meteorological that typically occur here in the UK. Though, according to the British Geological Survey, 20 to 30 earthquakes are felt by people each year in the UK. Also, climate change and sea level will almost certainly heighten the risk of coastal flooding in coming years. But it is still actually a flu pandemic that is at the top of the risk factors affecting the UK at the moment. But there are incidents that happen abroad. Of course, you remember the Bali bombings in 2002 and the Asian tsunami in 2004, which affected British UK citizens who then came home in all sorts of different states of trauma and physical condition. You may have members in your congregation who go abroad on holiday and get involved in these things and come home. You may have members in your congregation who work overseas as missionaries, as aid workers, who get caught up in any one of these categories of event, and to whom your church feels a duty of care. So don't think that we're only, or need only to be concerned with those things which happen specific to the United Kingdom. Hydrological and meteorological incidents are natural events or natural hazards that take the form of storm surge, for instance in low-lying coastal regions such as the 1953 East Coast storms, the Towin floods of 1990, takes the form of river flooding, Carlisle, Cumbria, Doncaster, Tewkesbury, Somerset levels have all known recent incidents of such a thing. But most of the events that happen in the UK fall under the category of what are typically identified as man-made, such as transport-related, air, sea, land transportation. There were a number of those affecting the railway and aircraft transportation in the 1980s, so that it became infamous as the decade of disasters, and that was the decade in which my own birthing in this particular field came about. In fact, the year 2017, of course, witnessed a series of terrorist incidents, which is now very high on the agenda of disaster threat in the UK. Manchester, the London terror attacks, and then the catastrophic fire at the Grenfell Tower in London. To ensure as much relevance as possible, therefore, I want to address incidents such as these UK-based ones, or the so-called man-made ones, as well as those which we typically identify as natural. Having said that, I must say that I find the distinguishing dualism of natural and man-made disasters very misleading. And also, from my research perspective, dangerously distracting and dishonest. My own fieldwork in addressing some of the worst disasters in history has shown these so-called natural disasters, in fact, to be very, very human ones. I want to begin, therefore, with a quotation which I often pop up when I'm presenting, because I haven't found one that, in a sense, betters this, from Professor Anthony Oliver Smith, the University of Florida. Not a Christian that I know of, but nevertheless, he says something which I think is very, very accurate indeed. In short, disasters are not accidents or acts of God. They are deeply rooted in the social, economic, and environmental history of the societies where they occur. Moreover, disasters are far more catastrophic events. They are far more than catastrophic events. They are processes that unfold through time, and their causes are deeply embedded in societal history. As such, disasters have historical roots, unfolding presents, and potential futures according to the forms of reconstruction. In effect, a disaster is made inevitable by the historically produced pattern of vulnerability, evidenced in the location, infrastructure, socio-political structure, production patterns, and ideology that characterizes a society. And I have to say, I agree absolutely with him. When the 7.0 magnitude earthquake struck Haiti on January the 12th, 2010, the catastrophic results were precisely because of the factors Professor Oliver Smith lists. The same is true for the results of Hurricane Katrina when it struck New Orleans in August 2005. The same was true of the impact of the super typhoon Yolanda, or Haiyan, when it swept through the tiny island of Bantayan in the Philippines in late 2013, and when prolonged rainfall led to the Somerset levels flooding the village of Moreland in early 2014. All involved natural events, hazards, but the disasters were humanly caused. Yet it seems so common to distinguish between natural and man-made disasters in the public sphere today, that there must be an obvious reason for the distinction. How many times have I heard preachers speak of natural disasters? The term just trips off the preacher's tongue. So what I want you to do now, just very briefly for a couple of minutes or so, is get in your 2s and 3s and just talk about, why do we associate suffering and God so easily with natural disasters? Do that now as the clock ticks. Good to hear such a buzz of conversation. My mission today is twofold. First of all, to disabuse church leaders or church workers of this false and damaging distinction between natural and man-made disasters. Now, why do I say that? Because, first of all, this distinction is just not true. It is just not true. There are no natural disasters, certainly not in the sense that we typically use the term and context of disasters today most frequently. The distinction is also damaging and distracting, and it is so because it distracts from our culpability. It distracts also from our divinely mandated responsibility of how to live in God's creation. And it distracts from our moral and practical contributions that we can make in terms of disaster risk reduction. And I really cannot express strongly enough this particular point. In doing so, and here is an important caveat, please do not confuse my mission with those prophets, P-R-O-P-H-E-T-S. There are other prophets of the other kind, which we will come on to, that invariably emerge after a disaster, telling us that the event happened as a direct judgment of God upon those naughty communities that suffered most, as happened in Haiti, as happened in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Sadly, all too often, those who suffer most in disasters are those who are in fact least responsible, namely the poor, the deprived, the suppressed, those in low-income countries whose economies and standards of living are largely controlled by those in high-income countries. When we believe that some natural occurrence took place which resulted in catastrophic loss of life and or livelihoods, then it's easy, in one sense, to become resigned to the fact that there are forces of nature so strong and overwhelming which we can do nothing to control. Small, frail, little human beings that we are. We are no match against those forces of nature. This perception leads to our response becoming one of a symptom focus. And it's all about perception. Perceptions are so important. If you perceive that what has happened is a product of nature, so overwhelming that we poor little human beings couldn't do anything, then our response will be influenced by that perception. And our response will be directed to the symptoms of what's happened, the suffering, the damaged property, the livelihoods. And it will be a response based on charity. We want to help. It will be a humanitarian response. And we will come across as being saviors of these poor, damaged communities. And this is where the other prophets can easily come in, because there is this thing, this whole industry, a burgeoning multi-billion-dollar industry that is now responding to disasters. And we call it disaster capitalism. And the response will be temporary. As long as there's money in it, or as long as it's a crisis, we stay. If your perception is somewhat different, that in fact what has happened has been man-made, then your response may well be very different. It will then be a systemic response. It will then be one of solidarity, not charity. And that is something that is a mantra that is being heard increasingly coming out of the low-income countries today. We don't want charity. We want solidarity. We want you high-income people to appreciate that what has happened to us has affected us so badly because of injustice. And that is a systemic issue. And that is where they are saying and pleading with us in the high-income countries for our focus to be. Humanitarian, of course. But nothing will change until the systems change. And so that must be long term, because systems do not change overnight. So what does the science tell us? Let's look at Haiti, for instance, in 2010. Science tells us that the capital, Port-au-Prince, down here, and the other major one, which I haven't identified, Cap-Haïtien, the two major cities in Haiti, are built, as you can see, slap bang on top of two major seismically active faults that traverse the country. In 1751 and 1771, earthquakes totally destroyed Port-au-Prince, albeit it was much, much smaller then than it is now. 3 million people of the 10.3 million people that inhabit Haiti are crammed together in Port-au-Prince. Science tells us, in other words, that earthquakes are natural events. But from a faith perspective, the Judeo-Christian scriptures do not have a word that means nature. They have the word that means creation. And that word is used throughout the Old Testament, for instance, in many different ways, sometimes synonymous with wonders. Wonders, things that inspire awe and worship. Things that you and I love to visit today when there's no human beings attached to them and take photographs of. Mountains, valleys, volcanoes, glaciers, stars in the sky, and we ooh and we ah, and we worship God as creator for his creation. We might call these natural hazards. I don't have a problem with that. They have the potential for causing harm. But they are not disasters, because God created them. Not many theologians and pastors use this term now, natural hazards. It tends to be the geographers and the earth scientists who use it very commonly. But we've been left behind in the religious traditions in this. We still talk about natural disasters, and we're wrong. And if we're not careful, we cast a dark shadow over the Creator himself. Well, does this mean then that God devastated Haiti in 2010? Or anywhere else where earthquakes have killed people? Is God the murderer we should rail against because the science and the scriptures tell us that God created earthquakes? And in his design, they are good. Indeed, wonderful. On the other hand, ought the real responsibility to lie with us human beings, who, having lost the requisite wisdom, no longer know how to live safely in this persistently mobile and therefore hazardous, wonderful earth. Or take Hurricane Katrina. Filled the Gulf of Mexico to a frightening proportion in late August 2005 as it steered its course for southern Louisiana, the Mississippi Delta, and the historic city of culture and cuisine called New Orleans. Science tells us that hurricanes are necessary aspects of the natural world and the creation. We need them. Also, in the end, Katrina never did hit New Orleans. Missed it. The hurricane, which missed New Orleans, was not much worse than Betsy had been back in 1965 and Camille had been in 1969. When people woke up on the morning of the 30th of September, the 29th rather of August 2005, they thought the hurricane was gone and the problem was gone. The wind had died down, the rains had died down, and initially there was no water. Problem solved. We dodged the bullet, as they said. But what devastated New Orleans, flooding it to depths of 10, 11, 12, 15 feet, 80% of the city, what devastated New Orleans was the failure of the artificial levee system, built and maintained by the Army Corps of Engineers under federal orders and on a meager federal budget to protect what has been regarded historically as a vital port and center of commerce essential to the whole of the USA. What devastated New Orleans was the result of centuries of human hubris, attempting to order the mighty Mississippi River where to go and what to do, and thus preventing this beautiful natural resource from laying down and replenishing the deltaic sediments that are the basis for wetland vegetation that naturally absorbs the force of hurricanes and reduces storm surge. Those are disappearing at the rate of a football pitch every 45 minutes. And that is why the flood came in. Also, you have this spaghetti-like formation of pipelines that have allowed saltwater intrusion into the wetlands. And why do we have that? To satisfy the high-income countries' thirst for oil and gas, which has laid down this spaghetti-like formation, which has led to the intrusion of salt water into the wetlands, again destroying the vegetation and local livelihoods. And this hubris has led to a false sense of security amongst New Orleanians, so that too few have any real relationship with their natural environment, and too many are unaware of their true vulnerability. The science is telling us that in the next 50 years, the sea could well be up to the levees that the Army Corps of Engineers are frantically trying to reinforce. The sea. Nature, or creation, appears as an enemy only when humans attack or abuse it. This can happen for a variety of reasons. Out of hubris, or as Pope Francis puts it in his papal encyclical Laudato Si, unrestrained delusions of grandeur. I think he hit it on the head. It can happen because of ignorance, risk-taking for purely economic greed benefit. It can happen because we're just defiant and we're going to defeat nature. This happens when we view nature as an enemy that requires subjugation under human domination, as something wild that requires taming. And I suggest regarding nature in those ways, requires a completely false reading of the Genesis 1 to 3 statements, for instance, and the Pauline statements in Romans 8:20 through 25 about the earth groaning and in travail. Nature was created and remains, dare I say it, inherently good, because God did it. It is a potential friend and ally in life. What has happened, and what has happened in the theological concept of the fall, if you like, was humans' loss of wisdom when they lost their relationship with the Creator. And you can't have one without the other. The loss of requisite wisdom for living relationally and collaboratively as responsible, accountable stewards with the creation. And creation being made subject to the effects of abuse, to the bondage to corruption, as Paul calls it in Romans 8:21. Where there is abuse, then there occurs an inevitable, natural, providential kickback. And that is where the suffering comes from. Sometimes immediately, sometimes down the road. But always there will be a kickback. And someone somewhere will suffer. So much of the suffering in disasters comes out of these reactions from nature. Again, in his Laudato Si, Pope Francis, quoting Pope Paul II, says this: instead of carrying out his role, it's up there. No, we'll go on to that one. Instead of carrying out his role as a cooperator with God in the work of creation, man sets himself up in the place of God and thus ends up provoking a rebellion on the part of nature. And Francis himself then went on to state, this sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. This is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. From such abuse of the creation, inexorably comes so much of our own suffering. So what should be our own response? That's the second part of my mission. Let me just introduce you to another project I'm involved with, which is called Tragedy and Congregations. It's headed up by Professor Chris Southgate, the University of Exeter. And the purpose of this project is to resource churches to respond in a healthy way to the impact of tragedies, local and global, through training ordinands in good practice, careful reflection, and personal resilience. This is a project that I'm very happy to be involved with myself, as it injects theological rigor into an area of profound pastoral need in the UK church, and one that is regrettably lacking in my view. So take a note of the website and just keep your eye on that. It's a work in progress. It's a research program that's going through until 2020. So for those of you in pastoral training or in pastoral work, then you could find some valuable resources on that. At the top of my list of absolute requirements for both individuals and churches in their response to disasters has to be compassion. A theology of compassion is a necessity for responding to disasters. But what does such a theology look like? I could wax on for hours on this. I love this topic. Yes, it has to include both feeling and action. It may begin with feeling, a powerful sensation in the guts. And I use that very deliberately. We have this wonderful word in the New Testament in the Greek, splagninsomai. You've come across that, no doubt. It's translated often as compassion or sometimes as mercy. In fact, there's a separate word for mercy. But it's a wonderful word because it evokes the Hebrew origins of compassion. And you know the Hebrews always express themselves holistically. And whereas we speak very abstractly, and they say, I have compassion, they would say, my guts are stirring within me. They felt things in this psychosomatic way. And that is what compassion is. You know you have compassion when it gets you in the guts. When there is a chemistry of reaction, of feeling, of sympathy, and a desire to want to do something. So splagnitzomai, literally heart, lungs, and liver. And this is witnessed, this whole concept, I mean now, compassion, is witnessed, I found very graphically, in the book of Lamentations. Here's a little bit of Bible study you can do if you're into that when you go back to your room. Look up Lamentations and read the first chapter, verses 1 to 11, and then read chapter 2, verses 1 to 19, and see if you can tell the difference, because there is a difference. I'll tell you what it is. In chapter 1, he's reporting on the siege of Jerusalem. Like a newspaper reporter, he's dispassionate, he's just recording and reporting what is happening. In chapter 2, the same person now is still reporting, but in the first person. And he has been so profoundly affected by what he has reported on and seen in chapter 1. That's compassion. Chapter 2, he has compassion. And Kathleen O'Connor, in her very helpful book on this, brings this out in this quotation. In Lamentations, the afflicted need a comforting witness. This is very powerful stuff, so try and read it and take it in. In Lamentations, the afflicted need a comforting witness. Neither the evangelist who announces the messages from outside suffering, nor the legal witness in a court of law who objectively states the facts, but something at once simpler and more difficult. The witness sees suffering for what it is without denying it, twisting it into a story of endurance or giving it a happy ending. There's all sorts of books on the market about suffering that unfortunately do exactly that. The witness sees suffering for what it is without denying it, twisting it into a story of endurance or giving it a happy ending. The witness has a profound and rare human capacity to give reverent attention to sufferers and reflect their truth back to them. And in the encounter with those who suffer, the witness undergoes conversion from numbed or removed observer to passionate advocate. So the second addition to compassion is not just feeling. it's action. You have compassion not just because you've been moved and stirred. You have compassion when what you have felt compels you to do something. To do something that will help, that is within your power to do. Most staggering of all in the Christian tradition, it is grounded in one of the most wonderful doctrines that I've come across, the Trinity. Have you ever thought of the doctrine of the Trinity as being something that ought to reduce you to tears of compassion? Why? You've heard of perichoresis? The mutual relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and their deference each to the other. There's no rivalry. There's no competition. They each defer to the other. And Paul brings that out in this incredible passage in Philippians chapter 2, where he's addressing the church, and all he's trying to do is tell them, stop falling out with each other, get on with each other, have fellowship together. It's a little peanut he's trying to crack, but he cracks it with a huge, huge sledgehammer as he talks about the relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. That's not easy, is it? Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not account equality with God a thing to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. That's where we model compassion. Time forbids me to going into details about the variety of ways it's possible to respond to a disaster in coming to very practical terms now. I could speak for ages on each one of these, but let me take you through some of them. Here's something you can do, and if I've achieved in doing anything this morning, then only if I encourage you to adapt your lifestyle to befriend and collaborate with the creation in responsible stewardship, I will achieve something. Do not think, when you hear about the mudslides in California, the little babies being dug out of the mud, when you see the media images of catastrophes the other side of the world, that really hasn't got anything to do with you. It's got everything to do with you and me. We are a human race. Let's get rid of this horrible Western individualism that so, it's I daren't use the term here, but it's almost in our DNA, isn't it, to think like this. It's so natural. We crave it. Let's get rid of that. What happens the other side of the world in an earthquake, when a house collapses in a poor district, has something to do with me and has something to do with you. Lifestyle changes are absolutely necessary in the high-income countries. If those in the low-income countries who are so vulnerable are going to be more protected. There are opportunities for those of you who do to become disaster assistance response people. You can become chaplains in NGOs that work overseas. I was one. In fact, that was my introduction to Haiti, working with Samaritan's Purse. Ascension Trust have this series of response pastors. That's why I ended up in Manchester and London and Grenfell Tower, using street pastors and training them to become response pastors. We have that kind of network here in the UK. The Billy Graham Evangelistic Association have a rapid response pastors in America. You could become an aid worker. That can be part-time, or that can be full-time. You can help best with your skills. When I was in the Philippines just recently, I was so heartened to meet two young American, well, I say young, I suppose, compared to me, young guys who were very skilled in their business acumen within the United States and in China and various other parts of the world. They went to the Philippines after the hurricane to just try and see what they could do. And they became so attached to the communities there. They married, they settled down, they now live there, and they run this business, Young Pioneer Disaster Response. And not only that, they've set up community businesses making properties, hurricane and earthquake resistant properties out of bamboo, because bamboo is so proliferant within the Philippines. And they're just committed to it. So learning how you can best use your skills. Is there a sense in which God may want you to use your skills now? Rather than in the great interests of making profits for a high-income country, to go and live and work cheek by jowl in a low-income country. And then, for those of you destined for the UK, get into emergency response systems. Your diocese will have emergency response systems. They will be locked into, I can guarantee you they will. And there is a great need for enthusiastic, compassionate volunteers to become members of those emergency response systems. You may just become a befriender and a listener. I say you may just become a befriender and listener. That is so critical. We are not good listeners. And in the field of disaster and trauma response, listening is absolutely critical. Those of you who are going into the pastoral ministry, the sensitive construction of church services and worship. Have any of you ever read that article by Carl Trueman? He brought it out, I forget which journal it was in. You can access it online. And he went around some churches and he deliberately made a point of asking the elders, what have you got here for miserable Christians to sing? And he was appalled. He was shocked by their reaction because they just thought he was funny. They thought he was joking. But where in the world should heartbroken, devastated people feel they should be able to go to find compassion and help if it's not where God's people are? But so often where God's people are, we're clapping and we're singing and we're waving and we're so happy, and they feel totally unqualified to be there. Donating wisely. Whenever I do these presentations, people invariably ask me in the Q&A, tell us how it best to give. Wisely. But remember, it's not charity that the people want, it's solidarity. So be very careful how you give, where you give. Be very careful to study and do your homework. And then praying passionately. And finally, just be there, somewhere, and do something. Because we live in this mobile, hazardous world that God has created. These things will happen. and inevitably they will be human caused. So don't blame God. Do something to change the way things are. Thank you. Oh, can I put up? Oh yeah, I forgot to put up this. I'll leave it up there. That's Grenfell Tower. And that's a quote by B.B. Warfield, the conservative, some would say staid, reformed theologian. I think what he says there is absolutely masterful, so I'll just leave it there. And then later on I'll flick it, and there'll be a couple of books that I'm advertising. They're not connected with Faraday, they're my own books, but I have permission to flag them up for you. Thank you, Keith. Any questions?
Thank you, Roger. I can tell from the sort of quiet that people were thinking very hard about that and being engaged and involved in all that Roger was saying. But we do have 15, 20 minutes for questions, for feedback, for comments, Roger. Would like to kick off. This one down here.
Thank you very much for that. Fascinating and very moving, actually. I completely buy your framework, right, that there's no such thing as natural disasters. But I'm left with just one area on your list, and that was the extraterrestrial. Right. What's your take on asteroids?
Yeah, I knew there was someone who would. There's always one. It's either that or viruses. Yeah, I don't know what my take is on. I mean, similarly with viruses, although I think with viruses there certainly are a lot of human interference with the way viruses function and the interactions they can have. And Keith would know more on that than I would. In the case of asteroids, I don't know, because I'm not not an astrophysicist, and I don't really know the function. So that's all I can say. I could say, you know, I could take the fallout. We live in a fallen world, so everything's out of kilter. Certainly, everything is not the way it is meant to be. Certainly, everything is not the way it is meant to be. And I think that's the closest I can get to it. I'm sorry.
Question at the back, and then this one down the front here.
Thank you so much for that. A question, I was just thinking of the incident of the Tower of Siloam in the Gospels, and people come to Jesus and say, you know, were they more sinful than others? And his response is perhaps not what one might call compassion. He's focused on the reality and the necessity of repentance. And I just wonder if you had any comments on that parable and Jesus' reaction especially. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, again, nothing conclusive except that everything Jesus said is clearly in a context. And in that particular context, we have reason to at least surmise that there were those there with not the purest of motives for looking for answers. And Jesus was very quick on that, wasn't he? He didn't tolerate fools easily in that sense. But also, I think, they were drawing his attention to these two catastrophes that had happened. And we don't know that was all he said, because everything Jesus said is not written down, because if it was, it would be too many books to do so. So what he was doing there was, or at least what is recorded he was saying there, had to be in line with Luke's general theme for the gospel. And clearly Jesus was wanting to take the opportunity to make a point, and a very important point at that point. I mean, there were many other times when he clearly demonstrated compassion. That was beyond question. But here was one where he wanted to convey to the people that they were not separate from what had happened. Again, the point I've been trying to make, you know. And we're very good at that, aren't we? At sort of separating ourselves. It was nothing to do with me. That's Pilate. And those, you know, or those naughty Galileans, you know, who died. People said of Hurricane Katrina, it was New Orleans. That's why it happened. And New Orleans is a very naughty city. Very naughty city. Well, I'm afraid the Christians in New Orleans said, but if that was God's aim, he missed. Because the really naughty parts of the city never got flooded. And it was the poor and disenfranchised that suffered most. So I think that was the critical point. Whenever something like this happens, again, we can't just switch off and say, it was nothing to do with me. If anything else, we've got to face up with the fact, well, what if that happened to me? Am I ready? Am I ready to be just going about my ordinary business and wham, I'm dead. And I'm before my Maker. Wasn't that the point he was wanting to make? And in the context of eternity, which is the context in which Jesus moved, that's very, very important.
I'm with you 99% of the way, and I want to just unpack the 1%, if I may.
Mm-hmm.
There is an element in Scripture which talks about God actually not being 100% good as we would understand it. Something with Job in particular, but what happens with the exile, Isaiah, God is the one who creates weal and brings woe.
Mm-hmm.
And classically, the understanding of calling God good, we have to say that God is wholly good, and there is no evil in God. You know, in God is light, and there is no darkness at all, and that sort of stuff. But we have to be very careful that our use of the word good isn't 100% human. And in other words, that our notion of what good is isn't used to limit what God does.
Sure.
And I think that we have to, if like, leave a little room for something which we experience as awful to actually be of God.
Absolutely.
That's my 1%.
Oh, well, I'll fill that 1%. I'm absolutely with you on that. Yeah. Providing we maintain the integrity of God himself. I don't need to. He's big enough to retain that himself. There are aspects of God. There is a wisdom of God that is, I think, Walter Storff, when he wrote that little book, Who Moved the Mountain, he said, the net of my meaning is too small, something like that. Absolutely. And Job, of course, is the classic one, because Job, for all his protesting, but isn't it wonderful how God allowed that protesting? Didn't thump him down, didn't beat him because he had a rant and he had a mood on. You try going through what he went and not have a mood on. But at the end of the day, God seems to reveal himself to him almost in a shock awe kind of process. You know, it was more than that. Of course it was. It wasn't George Bush going into Iraq. But whatever was communicated to Job, he perceived it as not being a threat, as something that he just had to bow down. Absolutely. We have very warped concepts of goodness and kindness. And this leads me to introduce, to say something, if I may, which I didn't say, which I think is very important and has come out of my own research, and a bit attached to that statement I put up about, or made about the good news, right at the beginning of the presentation. One of the findings that's coming out of my own research is that we in the West are very, very cosseted. We are not ready for earthquakes and massive floods and massive disasters. Because if what happened in Haiti happened here, would present our psychological services with overwhelming, totally overwhelming work. They did not experience the levels of trauma that Western assumptions tend to make. We are a cosseted society. And because we're so developed and we have the ability and the science and the technology, we can ensure we are protected up to a point until something really bad happens. And then we're so ill-equipped because we've not had the experience. We've not had the training. We've not had the hard life. And those who tend to cope best in catastrophic events are those who have had hard lives. Sorry.
There's another question there.
I thought that what you were saying about compassion and wisdom and action was really helpful. One of the questions that I have is about how sometimes we're driven by empathy, which is not wise, but actually can sometimes do more harm than good. And sometimes we're stuck to know which are the organisations and which are the actions for us to get involved with, because you don't want to do more harm than good. So can you say something about our wise discernment about where to invest our energy and our support?
That's a very good question. It's also an exceedingly difficult question for me to answer. Unfortunately, one of the things I've learned going around the different locations that I have, I've learned a lot about what not to do. I've learned about the good things that organizations have done, and there have been very good things. But I've learned also a lot about the bad things that organizations don't even recognize, because they just move on to the next disaster with the same model that they failed with in the previous one. And there's a lot of that going on. This is why I recommend doing homework. You really got to go into the websites. You've got to talk to the people, the organizations themselves, and find where you fit, quite frankly. And I've had to do that. I've started with organizations and I've left organizations because I felt almost embarrassed to be part of the organization for the reasons that you said. So I think you've got to see where you fit and do your homework thoroughly, assess your own gifts, your own abilities realistically, realize you're going into situations that are very different from what is normal. I have huge regard for medics and nursing staff who go into situations and apply Médecins Sans Frontières, for instance, Doctors Without Borders, this kind of thing. For those who and there's room for Christians there, with Christian medics, Christian skills. I also have regard for some Christian organizations who are willing to learn, who are going through learning curves. So without being, I know I'm not being much good to you on this, but I can give the principles, which is do your homework, assess your own skills, see where those skills fit best. And I think one important one that I've learned, when I go in, I have the privilege of going into these situations a few weeks or months after the crisis. We don't go in when there's a crisis. And then I embed myself in the communities of who have suffered. And I just do interviews. So I have the privilege of listening to these people tell me about the worst times in their lives, worst experiences in their lives. And one of the extraordinary benefits from doing that, although it's not part of my research briefing, is the number of people who, after we've done an hour and a half interview, and I thank them. I say, thank you so much for sharing that with me. And they thank me. They say, it's really helped, because never talked about it. So we never underestimate the power of listening. And just listening to people tell their stories. And never assume that people don't want to do that. Whether it's your neighbor, or whether it's someone, in the city, or whether it's someone overseas. I believe there is great power in people telling their stories. There's great healing in people telling their stories, because it helps the brain, coming back to the plasticity of the brain. Just to be able to take that catastrophic event which did your head in, and be able to tell your story and say, hey, I survived. And all that jumble of mishmash that was in the brain that made no sense suddenly begins to fall into place. And there's tremendous healing in that. That doesn't really help you, does it?
One more question and then we'll move on. So,
just to say something in response to that, which might be a helpful resource for some here. So there's kind of a classic book in that area called When Helping Hurts, which you're probably familiar with, which might be an interesting resource for some to read. But also more recently, Tear Fund and I think a few other collaborators have put together a resource called Poverty Matters, which is designed as a church resource for PCCs or groups thinking about mission giving, to kind of work through questions of how to invest in their area, how to invest in their giving wisely, and it sort of presents the questions rather than answers, but as a resource for you to think through. So I can maybe give it to somebody for the Moodle if that's useful.
Thank you.
Okay, great.
thank you, Roger. Thank you. Over this time, you've informed us, you've moved us, and you've challenged us, and that's a rare combination. Thank you ever so much. Can we join together?